Hello, and welcome to the second session of the Cultural Policy Action Lab. My name is Randy Engstrom. I use he, him pronouns. And on behalf of my collaborators, Jen Cole and Estrella Esquilin, and our producing partners for today's session, Pam Bro from National Assembly of State Arts Agencies and Eddie Torres from Grantmakers in the Arts, we are so glad that you're joining us today to talk about grant making and investments in the public sector. This is, as I mentioned, the second part of an 8-part series that's looking at how we can create greater racial equity through public policy in the arts. And each week will feature a different presenting partner. Today's structure will be a little different if you joined us last week for Grounding Racial Equity and Cultural Policy in the Public Sector, where in order to accommodate some schedules, much of the content was pre-recorded. We do have the majority of the presenters here, and we will be interacting in the chat. You can put questions in the Q&A, or you can put them in the chat, and all of us who are here with you today, we'll do introductions in a moment, we'll be able to answer and interact with you. And we're really excited to have you with us today. So thanks for joining us. I will hand it over to my collaborator, Jen Cole. Jen?
Hello, everyone. I'm Jen Cole, and I use she, her pronouns, along with Randy, Estrella, and our other collaborators and co-designers. I'm really happy that you're here to join us today to kind of explore what we can do and change and shape towards racial equity in the public sector. I want to acknowledge that even in this time of a few years where we've been socially distant and dispersed across the United States, it's really important for us to continue to ground ourselves in actually the land that we all occupy. And today we're connected to Grantmakers in the Arts as the lead sponsor of this session, who is located on Lenape land. Many of our other presenters are coming in from other stolen lands as well. This acknowledgement is meant to recognize that the history and legacy of colonialism that displaced the first peoples exists and is woven through our public policies at almost every level of the government, which we're seeking to change today by coming together. We're all connection to and living in these sanctioned policies that we're going to sort of talk about today. And aside from shifting policy in the public sector, it's important that we move beyond the land acknowledgement as a performative action and really seek to adjust behavior related to land back and other movements that support self-determination of Native peoples. So today in the chat, we're actually going to be asking you to think about moving past the land acknowledgement into action with your time and financial resources to leading Indigenous-led collectives and organizing efforts across the country that seek to really liberate land, power, and policy. And I'm going to turn it back to Randy.
Thank you, Jen. So now we want to do a little bit of who's in the room. We are coming from different locations, as Jen said. I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, the Duwamish and the Muckleshoot here in Seattle, Washington. But we want to know how you approach this space. Are you a public funder? Do you work in another function of local government? Are you a grant maker? Are you with a foundation? Are you an artist? And we wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. So we'll leave this poll up for a minute. We are really glad that you're here. We also wanted to leave space for everyone who's going to be in the chat with you to introduce themselves briefly. So as you're entering information, and we thank you for that, I'm going to turn it over to our other colleagues to introduce themselves, because we will be with you backstage today. Jen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jen Cole, and I am the Dean of the Pacific Northwest College of Art here in Portland, Oregon.
I'm Eddie Torres. I'm President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. I use he, him pronouns. I'm coming to you from the unceded land of the Lenape-Munsee people here in Queens, New York. For those of you who can't see me, I'm a cisgendered male with dark hair and eyes and a white beard, wearing a dark blazer with a Zoom backdrop of a library behind me. Let me hand it over to Tariana. Tariana?
Hello, everyone. This is Tariana Navas Nieves. I am joining you from Denver, Colorado. And by the way, I'm trying to, oh, here I go. Tariana Navas Nieves from Denver, Colorado, land of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. And I am currently in my office. I'm a dark hair with dark eyes. My skin color is light brown, and I'm wearing a black hat today, so it's great to be here. And I will pass it to Ryan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Coons. I'm Folklife Specialist at the Maryland State Arts Council, and joining you today from the unceded lands of the Susquehannock and Piscataway peoples, as I will talk about in greater depth later in today's presentation. And we're having storms today, so my video is not working, and it's possible that I might be in and out a little bit. So my visual image to you at the moment is a gray square.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing that. We're now going to pivot into the recorded video. Know that we will be with you here to answer Q&As. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will respond to them in kind. And we'll be here to close out with you at the end of the recording. So thank you again for being with us. We look forward to our time together. Handing the virtual mic to Eddie Torres.
The Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series is a leadership and professional development community of practice program for public sector workers who seek to advance racial equity through arts and culture and public policy. We're starting today with the section on public investments and grants. I'm Eddie Torres. I'm president and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, and I'm joined by Pam Bro, the president and CEO of National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, to whom I am so grateful because Pam has been essential to the curation of this presentation. We're going to be joined by Michael J. Bobbitt of Mass Cultural Council, Ryan Coons from Maryland State Arts Council, and Tariana Navas Nieves from Denver Arts and Venues. Now, just to begin, we want to start with what we believe, what we hold as core and central to this entire Action Lab and Learning Series, and also what's informing the rest of this discussion today. We believe that central to the mission of public agencies that support arts and cultures is service to everyone. We must support the capacity of public agencies to serve everyone. This capacity building support must center racial equity. Now, Grantmakers in the Arts' view on the issue of racial equity is that we are not race exclusive, but we are race explicit. And we've made a strategic decision to foreground racial equity in our work for several reasons. The first is that within other oppressed people's communities, including women, members of the LGBTQI community, people with disabilities, and others, people of color still face the worst social outcomes. So, for instance, the median weekly earnings of women are about 81 cents on the dollar compared to men, but that is if they are white. For Black women, it's about 65 cents on the dollar. For Latinx women, it's about 61 cents on the dollar. In terms of the trans community are in the aggregate twice as likely to live in extreme poverty as the general US population. That's twice as likely though if they're white. If they're Latinx, it's 7 times the poverty rate. If they're Black, it's 8 times the poverty rate. If you look at data from National Disability Institute, while the general US population, about 11% live in poverty. For people with disabilities, it's about 24% that live in poverty, provided they're white. If they're Black, it's about 40%. The other two issues are closely related. We feel that the strategy of combining considerations of race with other considerations too often result in considerations of race being pushed into the background or ignored. For instance, the studies have shown that in the first couple of decades of affirmative action, most of the social gains in education and employment have been made by white women. And this is related to our last point, which is that racial injustice keeps oppressed people separate. Now, we actually believe that white women should benefit from affirmative action. But statistically, the majority of white women surveyed are actually opposed to affirmative action when it's framed as primarily a benefit for BIPOC people, which statistically it's not. But this also plays into a larger dynamic, which is the use of the fear of racialized people to oppose programs and efforts that actually benefit white people. For instance, most forms of social support, the recipients are primarily white folks, whether that's SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, Medicare, etc. But when they are racialized, and studies have shown this, when they are explicitly racialized, support for those programs by white folks tends to drop. And again, this is actually statistically correlated by studies out of University of Berkeley. Now, we believe that all oppressed groups need to be supported by funding both public and private. We foreground race where race explicit because we believe that the racialization of people in America actually harms all other oppressed groups just as much as it harms them. And so this leads us into what we see and what we want to replace when it comes to public support for the arts. The things that we want to advocate replacing include shying away from discussing our values, colorblindness, and inclusion without agency. And specifically, we want to replace those with facilitation of cultural self-determination toward the building of civic and economic power, the valuing of economic, racial, and intersectional equity toward justice, and the celebration of public agencies advancing equity toward justice by challenging the systems that propagate inequities. And now I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Pam Bro, President and CEO of National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. Pam.
Thanks so much, Eddie. Hello, everyone. I'm Pam Bro. I am a Black female with tan skin and dark curly hair, and I'm happy to share brief objectives for this discussion with you. First of all, we begin with the sharing of inspiration from examples of public agencies' processes of embracing racial equity. That's particularly important because we learn best from each other. We'll also be sharing stories of our colleagues' efforts, their lessons learned, and advice for those of you who are starting your own processes. We have a few additional objectives for this module as well. We'll be sharing examples of critical leadership competencies in action, and our panelists today really demonstrate those beautifully. Those competencies include public policy understanding, mapping and navigating authorizing environments in the public sector. As in other sectors, there's no such thing as one boss, the boss, and the authorizing environment is often very complex. We'll also be sharing translating across sectors and across levels of power. So I am pleased to begin by sharing a bit of the history of how state arts agencies came to be. Two of our panelists today are from state arts agencies. And this is a very, very short history lesson, but I think an important one in the public sector arts space. In 1899, America's first state arts agency was created in Utah. And I'm delighted the legislature in Utah had that foresight in 1899. After that, 18 such agencies were created by state legislatures, and all of that was before the National Endowment for the Arts was established. And it was established in September of 1965. And so in those earliest of years, the NEA's Art for All Americans approach resulted in what we know today as the Federal State Arts Partnership between the NEA and state arts agencies. And that partnership and that approach was really catalytic in the development of more state arts agencies across the country. So public art, as you probably know, has been one of the hallmarks of public sector work since the 1960s, where state arts agencies are concerned. Hawaii launched the first ever Percent for Art program, and Hawaii did that in 1967. And that inspired other states to follow suit. The 1960s gave us a true turning point, I think, for art in public places. And of course, some of that inspiration stems from the WPA back from the 1930s and 40s. Arts education is certainly another hallmark of public sector practice, and this is true for state arts agencies as well. And so arts in schools programs were underway in all 50 states, artists in schools underway in all 50 states back in 1974. There's a continuum where arts education is concerned. In 1995, the US Department of Education and the National Endowment for the Arts joined forces and created the Arts Education Partnership, which laid a national foundation for arts education development. And the AEP is still doing great work today under the auspices of the Education Commission of the states. There was certainly a great deal of National Endowment for the Arts and state arts agency grant making in arts education and arts in education over time before the 2000s. And of course, since then, it's really a primary focus across the country. An additional focus occurred in 1999, when we saw shifts to deepen the placement of creativity within the broader economy. Creative economy studies were born, and specifically the first came from NEFA, the New England Foundation for the Arts. They published their first ever creative economy study in 1999, and that really created inspiration across the country. It was groundbreaking. Louisiana's study came next, and it was the first cultural economy plan. It was rolled out in 2005, very much influenced by NEFA's work, and many state arts agencies followed suit pretty quickly after that. And so today, especially where equity is concerned, and certainly advancing equity and racial equity in particular is why we're assembled here today. But I'd like to add that today, state arts agencies are collectively investing over $800 million in the arts. At NASA, we believe the public sector bears a special responsibility to help all communities thrive through the arts. And so relative to advancing equity, state arts agencies are embodying this responsibility through their own equity work. And each of them is tailored to its own geography, demographics, and authorizing environment. And you'll get to experience a bit of that with today's panel.
Thank you, Pam. So I want to speak briefly about local arts agencies, including just telling a brief story about my own experience at our LAA in New York. Now, there were all of 2 local arts agencies in operation in 1948, and these have grown into a community of about 55 by 1956. Now, by 1967, when we're beginning to see the NEA coming online, this grew up into 450, and it was about 1,000 in 1982, and we're at about 4,000 today. Now, the NEA made special funds available for encouraging state agencies to hire staff to help form local arts agencies or community arts councils. And so that's how we've gotten to be in the strong position that we're in now. Now, city arts agencies obviously have varied histories, often largely focused on economic development and branding of the city or the area, with strategies tied sometimes to supporting specific institutions. And complementary to this institution-focused or economic development-focused agenda, city agencies also often emerged from or came to develop a public programming agenda or even a public art agenda. Related to that, I actually wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with New York City's Department of Cultural Affairs, just because I think it really speaks to how broadly we can work when we work in the public sector and in the arts. You know, when I got to the city of New York, we were really very excited about supporting low-income communities. I mean, we were obviously excited about supporting organizations. When you look at how racialized money is. When you look at like the largest white theaters in America, their annual operating budget is about $40 to $60 million a year, whereas the largest Black theater has an annual operating budget of about $4 million. For the Latinx theater, it's about $3 million. And so we were really excited about how do we increase investment in low income and BIPOC communities. So, you know, we looked at the capacity building program that we had using community development block grant money. And we were really excited about this, but, you know, it was just organizations that were the point of intervention. And we thought, oh, wouldn't it be great if the neighborhood could be the point of intervention, and we could actually pay the salary of a cultural organizer in key targeted neighborhoods and serve the community in a holistic way, not just nonprofit organizations, but also individual artists, the small business community, informal coalitions. And so we basically thought, okay, this could allow us to act in concert with other agencies like planning, housing, health. But of course, this meant we had to actually expand our budget, and which meant we had to negotiate with the Office of Management and Budget. And so in order to do that, we had to figure out, we had to, as Randy Engstrom and Jen Cole and Estrella Esquilin, who run the Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series, we had to map and navigate the authorizing environment. So luckily, when I got to the city, I began working on, at City Hall's request, a number of us began working on the city's long-term sustainability plan. And so I was appointed to become a team leader for a team consisting of parks, health, voting rights, and other agencies to focus on neighborhoods and community cohesion and our chapter and our sections of the city's long-term sustainability plan. And so I made the argument that I'd learned at the Rockefeller Foundation, my prior job, which has been verified internationally, that the key to resilience to disaster is to have a community. Your neighbors are always your first responders. So that which builds a community builds resilience, which is the ability to bounce back from a disaster. So I argued that culture builds community, and this has been proven many times over by Maria Rosario Jackson at the Urban Institute, who's now our chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, and others. And all the other various agencies agreed. So I pitched them on the idea of expanding our capacity building program to serve cultural stakeholders in neighborhoods. And it worked. We were able to combine community development block grant money with city money and a small amount of private philanthropy to coordinate between the cultural stakeholders in the neighborhoods, coordinate access to our capacity building workshops, connect the cultural members to other agencies and to each other, and basically to build collaborative capacity. So we began the program in the South Bronx and in Central Brooklyn and Upper Manhattan and Jamaica, Queens. And it's continued all this time, and it's actually recently been moved from the Department of Cultural Affairs to the Department of Small Business Services because they recognized it as a value add for the small business community. And this paved the way for our development of the first cultural plan for the city of New York, which targeted BIPOC, low-income communities, disability communities, and artists for increased support. And so I just say all that to say, I'm really very excited about what state and local agencies can do. The capacity for scale and impact and influence is huge. And I'm so excited to be able to share the perspectives of our guest speakers today. I'm gonna stop sharing for one moment, just so that I can make sure I am pinning Dariana Navas-Nieves, so that you are the person that we see when I share my screen again. Oh, there we are. Dariana, please, we're so excited to hear your story.
Thank you, Eddie. And I'm very excited about sharing my story with everyone, my public art agency story. So I'm Tariana Navas-Nieves. My pronouns are she, her, ella. And I'm joining you today from Denver, Colorado, land of the Cheyenne, Ute, and Arapaho peoples. I also want to bring up and acknowledge that I am Puerto Rican, land of the Taínos, the indigenous people of the Caribbean. I am brown skin with long black hair and a mole under my lips. And today I'm wearing a brown newsboy cap, and I'm joining you from home. I am the Director of Cultural Affairs for the City and County of Denver. And I wear two hats with the city. I'm also on the city's equity leadership team. We oversee the racial equity and anti-racism work across all city agencies. As a city and county, we have about 13,000 plus employees. And my role is also to ensure that a cultural perspective is present in all government and agency areas. I'm proud to say that our agency, the Local Arts Agency, was the first agency in the city to have a formalized equity plan with external and external goals focused on operationalizing values, in this case, a commitment to transforming a belief in justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, transforming those values into a practice, meaning that those values are woven into all aspects of our work. And as an agency, we're focused on outcomes and a promise through our practice that to share power and actively engage in relationship building. You've probably heard that equity moves at the speed of trust, and our successes are directly tied to this practice. Our lessons learned, I believe, are a testament to that. And what drives me in my work is that I believe that we as a collective are capable of radical empathy and courage and a deep and transformational change, which I think that's at the heart of equity. So today, if I were to highlight aspects of our work that exemplify engaging in a racial equity practice, I would include the following, and especially within the context of when we think about the past 2.5 years of this coalition in which we've experienced a deadly global pandemic. We're still in the midst of it, an economic crisis, and a reckoning with racial injustice. So I think it's important to think about context and how those values have come into practice in a very unique way. So number one, what is an equity practice? I'll start by telling you what I believe is not. Awareness and understanding of systemic racism and the role of philanthropy, as funders and government have played historically in building and maintaining systems of oppression is important to understand that, but not enough. A statement of solidarity is not enough. We must engage in an active equity and anti-racist practice. So equity, diversity, and inclusion is not another program in your portfolio, is the why and the how. And the how is the steps we take ongoing, day in and day out in everything we do. The why is to achieve justice. And it's an enduring, unending reflection and examination of all processes we follow, which process is very much part of government, and the systems that we're a part of. And as funders in our decision-making, including funding and grant-making decisions, commission decisions, we should always look around and ask who is making the decisions, who is benefiting, who is not. We should look around the table. Do you have a diversity of perspectives, and in other areas of identity, including and beyond race and ethnicity. Let's just not address the symptoms, but the systems that perpetuate inequities. Number two, power and privilege. We cannot practice equity and anti-racism without acknowledging that as funders, as government, and this is whether we are government or a foundation, that we have great power and privilege, the power of decision-making, the privilege of access to dollars. Power is not a bad thing, but how we honor that power, how we share it, how we relinquish it, is what makes the difference. And in the public sector, the way in which we use our power and privilege, let's say wanting to focus our funding on those organizations that have been historically in the margins, is not as simple as private foundations creating a fund giving preference to BIPOC-led organizations, for example. In the public sector, we have to work very closely. I have our city attorney on my speed dial to ensure that we're supporting organizations that are engaged in an equity practice, but we cannot simply legally, as if you work in government, you cannot simply give preference to organizations based on race. And as a brown woman, I take very seriously the fact that I'm in a space that has not been accessible to many that look like me. And that for me is a big responsibility. I do not take for granted the power and privilege I hold. I honor it. And if you're a leader in your organization, take time for self-reflection and look and examine what type of power, what type of privilege you have and how you're using that. Number three, proximity and trust. And Eddie made a reference to how funding, right, especially when we think about the NEA, has been connected to the state art agencies for a very long time. And I remember maybe a year or 2 years ago where I made a big ask, and I was very, very blunt about talking to the NEA and saying, what about local art agencies? What we bring to the table is proximity and trust. That responsibility translates into our prioritizing and recognizing the value of proximity to and trust of the community. We are government, we are the funder, and more often than not, we, especially as government, are not trusted. My team, we spend a large part of our time building relationship with cultural workers, with organizations, artists, creatives, grantees, and community members, especially those that experience discrimination and are committed to using their experience for change. In order to build authentic relationships, which is at the heart, I think, of equity and government, to building trust within those relationships, we must get close and we must give time. Again, equity moves at the speed of trust, and building trust takes time. And once it's built, we must cherish it. So when we plan for partnerships, we must think long-term. Respect the time you must invest in relationship building, and respect your grant partner's time. In other words, you build trust by showing trust. The burden of understanding their work of your grantee partners, of your local organizations, that burden of understanding their work should be yours, should be ours. Let them do what they do best, and let's get out of their way. You should carry the burden of the funding process, as your work is to facilitate, to elevate, and to strengthen. And I would also like to mention how important it is to build trust within your team when you embark on this work. Not everyone will be in the same place, so be generous. Create that bond within your team. So think about how you're spending your staff meeting time, your one-on-one time. This work is about systems, dismantling systems and creating new ones. And it is about the humans that are around you doing the hard work. My staff meeting, for example, is about a team of humans. We start with 5-minute meditation time. We do a 10-minute shared learning. We have questions that are connecting us at a human level. So really be intentional at how you're spending that time to build those internal relationships. Next slide. Number 4, it's all in the details. And I would say is in all aspects of the process. And if there's something that we know how to do well in government, is process. Equity in simple terms is about constantly telling yourself, stop, slow down, and ask the questions. And again, stop, slow down, and ask the questions. And what are the questions? Is who is applying and who is not, and our responsibility to identify and invite potential applicants. Data is critical. track demographic information and don't be afraid of what you will learn through that data. Use what you learn, the good and the areas that need improvement to inform what you do. You must take a strategic approach in your recruitment process for potential grantees. I intentionally state that not be afraid, because when I initially told my team that we were going to start capturing this information, they felt this meant that I thought that they were not doing a good job, since their intentions were always to have diverse panels, selection panels, for example. So I had to reassure them that I trusted that we were doing a good job, but that we could always do better. The more targeted our practice was, the more equitable our funding process would be. To build that trust internally is so important. Also, who is making the funding decisions? Selection panels are comprised of the majority of panelists that represent BIPOC and other groups that have been historically in the margins, including people with disabilities and people that identify as LGBTQIA+. And as I said, we track this data for all of our grant panels. And if we have learned that in our selection panels, we have a strong representation from the Black and Latino community, this is something we had learned maybe about 5 years ago. We also learned that we had to do better with regards to Native people and people with disabilities at the time. So we also were then intentional about how we could increase that, that demographic representation. We also track by council district in our city in terms of identifying the gaps based on different neighborhoods. If your city is like our city, red line is still evident in how our neighborhoods resources have been distributed. So we are also very aware of how history has impacted that and how we can fill those gaps. What happens during the selection process? A little bit more about selection panels. Now you have a decision-making group with a diversity of perspectives. Who's in the room? Through the guidelines and through the discussion, we must challenge traditional priorities. For example, idea of excellence versus merit, for example, and defining merit, for instance, focusing on genuine partnerships with community, shifting focus from Eurocentric forms to a global understanding of culture. Is the artist challenging traditional art forms, art styles, etc.? You must also normalize and model behavior by sharing your biases. Whoever is leading the selection process and staff, and I'm looking at Pam because we've talked a lot about the fact that we have never been trained to meet mediators or facilitators when we're talking about empower systems. And I have shared as an example in our Music Advancement Fund, I may be Latina, but I am not a fan of mariachi music. So we have applicants in that musical genre. So the question is not whether I like mariachi music, but whether they are strong representation of that musical style, or whether they represent an important cultural aspect of our community. I've also shared that when we see applicants that are not cultural owners present a project of such culture, for example, a white applicant depicting an indigenous subject or working with indigenous communities, my antenna goes up. In my mind, there could be potential red flags. So I ask my team to share some of those biases. And we practice this by sharing our practice and making statements such as, this is my bias speaking, but I invite reflection and conversation. And these are, again, going really into the different aspects of process and decision-making. And we must make these changes in the systems. And if we make these changes in the systems, the outcomes will reflect these values of equity and justice. Why exactly do we need final reports? Ideally, don't require final reports. And I know that at times, sometimes with federal dollars, etc., you must have a final report. So if that's the case, make them as simple as possible. We do not require final reports. I believe that's a barrier to participation that you could eliminate. And remember that relationship you have. And when I said that you should build and nourish relationships, with that proximity and trust, you should already have that information from your grantee partners. So a final report can be a quick phone call to see how the project is going, how it went, and encourage, please ask them to share what did not work. When we do important work, it's rarely perfect. And we are committed to equity. That is a part of the process of growth and change. And what about guidelines and applications? Evaluate all guidelines, applications, processes, all of grant programs at least annually. It is an ongoing process of what I think a process of humility. We as funders are often arrogant. We as government are often arrogant, and organizations know their work best. Who are we to tell them how to go? Let's trust those in the trenches, know the opportunities and the challenges they face. We follow recommendations also, and I will share this in the resources. Next slide. The retool, Racial Equity in the Panel Process. I'm a co-author, as is Pam, and I had the privilege of participating in this work. And we, in an ongoing basis, seek feedback from community and grantee partners with regards to how we conduct ourselves within funding and grant programs. We're never shy to share what we can do better. In 2021, we invited BIPOC artists to a conversation and asked them, what do you need right now in the midst of this crisis? And surprisingly, they didn't have 100 asks, they didn't have 5, they had 11 asks, specifically 11 asks. And the majority were about creating more access to decision-making. I think Eddie mentioned is inclusion without agency is not really what we want, is inclusion and agency. And that's what they wanted. So remember accountability and relinquishing power. I took those 11 asks, took them back to my team. We went back to the group of artists, of BIPOC artists, a month later with responses and actions taken related to every single one of those 11 asks. So engage in these conversations, make yourself vulnerable and show that you can be trusted. And I will tell you that those conversations are difficult conversations. One of the hardest things was realizing that they were not aware of some of the good work we were doing. There were misconceptions about where our funding was going. In particular, I remember mural commissions in our case. And I felt so bad about the fact that, oh my God, we're doing all this work and they think the funding is not going to BIPOC communities. And that's on us, but that was our burden, our responsibility. So we realized what we could and had to do better in our engagement and outreach and sharing of information, in building avenues of awareness. And we had to do better in telling our story. We shared that the majority of our mural commissions were going to local artists rather than national artists, with incredibly strong representation of artists of color. They didn't know that. So if they didn't know that, it wasn't real. And that was on us. EDI in action, JEDI in action, a couple of examples of EDI in action on the value of trust and building and strengthening relationships. We believe in relationship-based funding, in relationship-based philanthropy. And all of our selection panels are community panels. We even have a grant program in which we partner with all of the human rights commissions, African American Commission, Latino Commission, Immigrant and Refugee, people with disabilities, older adults. So all of these groups that have been historically in the margins, and they are the funders. They determine funding eligibility, they determine process, they determine who are the grantee partners. We step back, we listen, and we learn. And I can tell you that's humility in action. So we build trust by showing trust, and we show trust through our willingness to learn and change and be better and relinquishing that power. And we've built relationship with these commissions, which are a solid community of partners that guide us and support us. This past year, we learned a local foundation that was funding a public art exhibition in a city park. The surrounding community reached out to us as the exhibit would be on loan. And one of the works is a bronze sculpture of a Buddhist monk. The artist's intention, the artist was a white artist, is a white artist, and her intention was to honor Buddhist culture, in particular, the figure of the monk. Since it's planned for a public park, we presented the selection of works to the Asian American Pacific Islander Commission. And we learned that in depictions of monks, they made recommendations for the artist to connect with the local Buddhist communities. We learned that in the depiction of monks, there is a very particular way in which the viewer has to be present in terms of looking up or looking down. I didn't know that. Based on that knowledge, based on that ownership of culture, they made very specific recommendations. And we created an exchange that was fruitful. and incredibly important. And they assumed good intention because they appreciated that we were the ones that they trusted and we were the ones reaching out. So please know that as I share this with great pride of what we've accomplished in changing systems, this has not been easy. Some of these changes took years. We also should expand our definition of arts and culture from Eurocentric art forms to cultural expressions as diverse and as broad as our communities. When we speak about arts and culture that we know well, that is not just about what is on the stage, but it's about family. Culture is family, culture is language, culture is history, heritage. We should embrace conflict, number 6, as part of the process. We've heard that conflict, from discomfort to active disagreement, is change trying to happen. Again, conflict is change trying to happen. So this is a learning journey, and it requires for us to stretch ourselves, managing discomfort and building skills to distinguish between real danger worthy of panic and stretched induced fear. An equity practice is like building a muscle, the equity muscle I call. You will be sore and your body will eventually get used to it. And if you are maintaining that muscle strength, you must challenge yourself, which means that you will be sore again, at times, again and again. So wrapping up, let's remember that there is urgency in this work, but we cannot rush this work. This is marathon work. Stop, slow down, ask the questions. The eradication of racism and the achievement of justice will not be accomplished through a single action, but through collective long-term systemic change, which is what all of us that are today coming together will speak to. So let's focus on the importance of radical empathy and imagination, of acknowledging and owning the dark truths of philanthropy and government, prioritizing relationship building, leveraging the boldness of this time, and finding a balance between urgent and methodical work. And I leave you with this quote by Madeline Hunter. If you want to feel secure, do what you already know how to do. But if you want to grow, go to the cutting edge of your competence, which means a temporary loss of security. So whenever you don't quite know what you're doing, know that you are growing. And I can tell you that it's something I feel and experience every day. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tariana. Thanks for the inspiration, for the strategic thinking, for practical solutions, and really for thoughtful and human first, right? Human first perspective. I do have a question for you before we move on. In this work, you are well aware that we have to translate it across sectors and particularly across levels of power. And that is critical and it's often challenging. And so I'm wondering about how you have done this translating across levels of power. Like, is there anyone who could have stopped your efforts? If so, how were you able to continue to advance the work in spite of resistance? Do you have some unlikely allies?
I think it's important to know when getting into this work that resistance is a given. It's just part of the process and the journey. And I think is good to come from, at least for me, I come from a place of generosity, that when that happens, I need to respond with love and understanding that we are not coming off from the same context. When we look at history, not everyone is knowledgeable, right, or knows the depth of how much systemic racism is part of our history, how much it shows up on the systems of today, how much is not related to who we are as individuals, but how much is related to the system that we do our work in. So and don't get me wrong, I'm human and I'm a brown woman. So in that moment, that resistance often feels painful, right? But then I remind myself to come from a place of generosity. And I think that without leadership, this work, frankly, is not gonna happen to the level that it could work. I mean, I think I did it quietly for many years at the beginning of my career, and I created some change, but I did it quietly, I did it subversively, and there was up to a level of the work that I could do. Leadership support is critical. And I think when we come to this work, we need to be prepared to how to respond, really importantly, how to respond to the resistance from leadership. And I mentioned that from a place of like literally have a script for how you will respond to that leader in your space when they're resistant, not from a place of not great intent, which I think is sometimes the hardest. They think they're doing it, they think they're supporting it, but they don't realize those blinders. So I think it's really just coming to the work ready with that script of how to say thank you for bringing that to my attention. Thank you for sharing vulnerably how you reacted to this or that. And thank you in advance to joining this important work. So in a way, it's acknowledging, showing trust and showing generosity and love. And then you get to the real talk, right? So I think it's just, if you're ready, if you're prepared that way, I think that for me has been critical in the times, because I have no doubt that probably all of you have been called into the principal's office at some point during your career. And I think we all need to be prepared for that. So.
Indeed. Such wisdom, like connecting love, generosity, and the realization that the context really can come closer, right? And working from that space of creating that common context to help perhaps detractors move a little bit closer to becoming allies, right? A little step at a time. But thank you. Thanks so much.
No, thank you.
Fantastic. I am so grateful, Tariana, that you're here and that you're going to stick around with us. I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Michael.
Hi, Eddie. Hi, Pam. Thank you so much for having me here. I am still somewhat of a newbie to the grant making world, so it's nice to be included into these really important and world-changing moments. I'm so inspired by everything you both have said, and Tariana, I am deeply inspired by what you have said, and it makes me feel like Mass Cultural Council is moving in the right direction, and we have a lot more work to do, but I'm thrilled to know that what you have said aligns with what we are doing, and I'll point out some of those places. My name is Michael Bobbitt. I'm the Executive Director of Mass Cultural Council for 1.5 years now. I use the he series pronouns. I am a cisgendered gay male, Black male who has lighter brown skin. I'm wearing a pink shirt, and behind me in my office is a lime green wall. So we coordinate very, very well. I'm calling from from Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is the land of the Wampanoag, Nipmuc, and Massachusetts people. So Mass Cultural Council has built out a racial equity plan, and I'm thank you for giving me the words, Eddie, that we are not race exclusive, but we are race specific. This plan is an extension of our 2017 strategic plan, which had one of its goals in it of advancing racial equity. When I got there, we decided to deepen that work and take it much farther and make it a priority. I say that only because this plan does focus on racial equity for all the reasons that you said. We will be building out, actually, we're building out right now a Native American and Indigenous plan, and we will be building out a deaf equity plan, a disability equity plan, and a rural equity plan in the coming couple of years. We wanted to provide racially equitable investment in the cultural sector, especially to the historically underinvested. One of the things that we talked about most importantly is that we're here to fund the sector, not the best of the sector. And so that word excellence needs to be eradicated, is being eradicated or redesigned, because that is what our jobs are as public agencies. We also want to really operationalize and guide the ongoing and long-term work of being an anti-racist agency with new behaviors, actions, procedures, and policies. We deeply want to embed this in the culture so that as we all move on from the council, whenever that time comes, this is embedded into who the agency is and becomes sort of second nature. And I'm actually seeing from my staff a huge evolution to really sort of leading with equity, which I think is pretty great. And the last reason why we built out a racial equity plan is we want to hold ourselves accountable to the public. I think this is part of what Tariana said, which is to build trust. I think a document that is publicly positioned is a great way to start building trust. People can actually see the actions you're taking, and it helps to take the actions of the work you're doing from a belief to a practice. And I think so much of us get stuck in the belief that we never actually come up with action plans. Next slide, please. So as we were designing the plan, luckily I walked into an agency that had a couple of years of racial equity training under their belt. We continued that learning by bringing in more experts. And then we had a full staff meeting and council meeting where we really sort of did a 90-minute conversation about why it was important to have a racial equity plan and what are the obstacles we may come across as we're building this plan. And the next step from there was that each employee and council member got to populate a spreadsheet with their actions and any ideas they had to promote racial equity, both internally and externally. And we divided it up in sort of four main categories. One was governance, where really sort of got the council to really focus on governance, because oftentimes your governing body will have lots of ideas about operations and programming, and they tend to not look at what they can do from a governance perspective. And then we also focused on operations and then programmatic. And the fourth section, which is not here, is sort of the sector, how we can support and convert the sector into being an anti-racist. All those ideas, there were hundreds of them, were then sort of boiled down by this volunteer-based task force of 21 people. It was 4 council members and 21 staff members and 4 council members, and 12 of them, almost half, identified as BIPOC. And so that task force took these hundreds of actions and boiled them down, consolidated them, and we came up with about 35 or 40. And then we started taking those action steps and putting them into through a few filters, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And once we had a draft of those action steps that were filtered through a couple of tools that we use, we shared drafts with BIPOC grantees, with Native American grantees, with national colleagues, including Pam Bro, who supported us there. We shared it with our legal team and several other focus groups. And every time we got feedback on those drafts, we went back and revised based on those feedbacks. Next slide, please. So the first filter, after we took all the hundreds of action steps and consolidated them, the first thing we did was took the main ones and we filtered them through SMART outcome goals. This technique was developed way back when, but it basically stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So what is the specific action you're taking? How do you measure it? Is it attainable? And sometimes I actually use the word aggressive instead of attainable, because I think that we have a 400 or really a 650-year-old head start if you think about colonization. And so we want to be aggressive. And then make sure that it's relevant and time-based. And a lot of the relevance had to do with making sure we were talking about racial equity and that we weren't trying to make this plan that was dealing with all the inequities that exist. That took a while. That took a while to really clarify that. There were some very difficult and great conversations around what the measurables look like, when we could get it done, but we got it done. We also, the next filter was to make sure we were centering the needs of BIPOC members of the agency and the cultural sector. oftentimes we build these racial equity plans and unknowingly we center the needs of white people and not the people that really need it the most. So that was very, very clear. So for example, if we said that we were striving for equal representation on our staff, we needed to know that the reason why we wanted equal representation was so that we can reflect the sector that we were serving. Again, we wanted to make sure that everything we were doing was also changing the culture of the organization, because I strongly believe that policies and programs without a real intention around the cultural shift do not last. I often tell arts organizations, your discount ticketing policy is not going to fix your racism problem. Your outreach program is not going to fix your racism problem. So you have to know why you're doing those things. Adding people of color to your board, if they don't have agency, as Eddie mentioned, you have diversity, but not agency, it's not going to fix your racism problem. Why are you adding those members to the board? Well, it's because you value their opinion and they bring in a perspective that you don't have on your board. So that is the cultural shift that you want to make. So the goal is, again, to make sure that everything is equitable, all of our grant making is equitable, and to really foster a culture around anti-racist beliefs. Next slide, please. Here's some highlights of the plans, and we'll share that with you on the website. Plus, I'll share with you a link to SMART outcome goals and a couple other tools too. So applicant recruitment was really important. And I say this because I do believe that the public sector funding world tends to adopt best practices that come from private philanthropy. And one of the things I think is pretty true about philanthropy in general is that we spend a lot of time stewarding existing grantees and very little time cultivating relationships with new grantees. And some of the stewardship tools that we use are site visit, office hours to renew existing grantees. I think final reports is a stewardship tool as well. And by the time you do all that administration, there's no time to meet new grantees. And so our grant systems and our databases look the same year after year. So because of the number of grants that we have and all the work that we're doing this year, we decided to outsource our recruitment and relationship building. So we hired 4 BIPOC outreach coordinators. These are people who are from the sector. We hired a Native American, Black, Latinx, Hispanic, and Asian outreach coordinators. They have the information about their cultures to be able to approach those organizations. And basically they serve as a way to introduce us to those organizations, and those relationships are being passed on now. We're extending their work for the next year, which I'm very excited about. But that was one of the tactics we used to sort of build these relationships. Now the program staff, they're required to, with measurables, to actively recruit and serve new applicants. It's a big learning curve for our program officers, who again spend more time doing customer service for existing grantees and not the kind of work for new grantees. And then we bumped up our translation and interpretation services. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I'll talk about it now. Some of this has to do with the work we're doing in our review and audit of our grant making. We are devaluing grant writing expertise and experience, so that first-time applicants can have just as much success in writing, but that means also devaluing the written word and the mastery of the English language. So we will soon be allowing people to do audio submissions and video submissions, or write it in their native language, and we'll take care of the cost of having it translated. We also found this awesome Zoom-like tool called Kudo, where all of us can be in one room. And Kudo, which was designed by people that used to work for the UN, has in the background people interpreting the words that I'm saying into whatever language you have requested in real time. There's like a 0.05 second delay or something like that. It's a pretty remarkable tool. We're doing a massive overhaul of all of our grant making, reviewing and redesigning from an equity lens. And I'm really proud to point out that the jumping off point for us was NASA's equity choice points. I encourage you all to take a look at those. They're brilliant, and it really helped everyone sort of have a framework for how to review and redesign your grant applications. We are looking at prioritizing the eligibility of applicants with some focus on BIPOC and rural and underfunded or under-resourced organizations. A lot of work in panel recruitment and training with lots of anti-bias training, and making sure that we have equal representation on our panels. One of the challenges that we had was we were using 50% as a measurable, and our lawyers did not like that. And so, but he was fine with the use of the word equal representation, which I think is basically the same thing. Really looking at the length and the content of the application, which means that we are using the term applicant-centric grant making, where we're focusing on making it as easy as possible for the grantees to get the money. And also with this is really focusing on the people that will have the hardest time getting the grant. So that person who is a one-shot person, she is, choreographing the dances and cleaning the toilets and writing the grants and doing all the marketing and doing all the recruitment. How can she be successful with her hour or 2 hours to sit down and write this application? And then again, lessening the focus on stewardship and more work on recruitment. And the last area that of highlights is sort of the resource creation. We're offering lots of trainings, outsourcing some of this work and paying for the work so that the whole sector can have racial equity training. We are creating sort of best practices around how to build your equity plan for your organizations. And the last thing that we're going to be working on is building sort of a cultural equity index or kind of a test so each organization can sort of find out where they are in their equity journey. And then it would give you, hopefully it would score you and then give you some thoughts about what actions you can take after you get your scoring. We feel like organizations can use this as an internal tool so they can see that they have a lot of work to do, maybe even externally. I know that many organizations are struggling to get their boards to shift, so maybe they can show their score to their board. And then eventually this could sort of be a tool that we use in how we decide what organization gets funded and what organization does not get funded. So those are some of the highlights. There are a lot more actions. Like I said, there are about 35 actions internally and externally that we have. Next slide, please. Some of the obstacles, as I mentioned, that when we did that scan of all the members of the staff and the council we got hundreds of ideas. Some were too broad and things that we do not have control over. And then there were too many action steps. This plan exists as a 3-year plan. And with the SMART goals, we were really able to identify in what year, what part of the year we were going to execute these actions. So a lot of the work was getting it simple. And then the other part was the intersectional justice of it all, that this plan, there were lots of things that people wanted to put in this plan that did not have to do with racial equity. The second part was defining BIPOC without unintentional exclusion. There were lots of things out there that we used that talked about the number of BIPOC people on your staff, the number of BIPOC people on your board. And we eventually landed with the purpose of the organization being about serving a BIPOC community primarily. But that was one of the things that became an obstacle. Certainly fear of political and legal pushback. Our lawyer had lots of things to say, and we took some of the advice and we didn't take some of the advice. And then political pushback, we were concerned. There are lots of anti-discrimination laws out there that actually, as Tariana mentioned, prevent you from doing set-asides for BIPOC organizations. One of the ways we are working around that is when you look at our plan, you'll see that we are quoting the executive order of our governor with some language from him. We're also quoting the executive order of the President of the United States. We're also pinning some of the other work that's done in other state agencies across the state and highlighting their work to show that we're not an anomaly. and in many ways to show that arts and culture is a health and human service, so that we are looking at what's happening in food insecurities and housing and healthcare. And some of those things actually helped us to build action steps. The last thing is we're on this side is that we are looking at examples of set-asides for BIPOC organizations and individuals that aren't legislatively mandated, so that we can show that there is precedent for doing this work without it having to be in the legislation. And then some of the stumbling blocks in our reviews of our applications are defining and measuring things like public value and impact. These are words that we used in our zeitgeist that I'm not sure we're all on the same page about. I would also put community in this list. And so we're bringing in someone to help us, at least as an agency, have one definition for what we mean. Defining and measuring excellence, or even eradicating this term. And that has been a difficult conversation because it's in our legislation and it's in our mission statement. I don't particularly think it needs to be a grant criteria, even if it lives in the legislation and the mission. So I'm hoping that we will either have a definition or come up with something else. And some of what Tariana mentioned, I think, are good things to consider. As I mentioned, the stewardship of existing grantees versus the cultivation of new grantees, making space and time for our program officers to do this work, and also coming up with, in many ways, lead sheets so that we are not all cultivating the same applicant, and how we're dividing up that work. The reality and perception of the administrative burden of applying to a state-run grant. I mean, there are some people that are afraid of government, and because of the processes that we have put in place, how large and long these applications are. So getting rid of things that we don't need, and really thinking again about applicant-centric grant making. How do we make it as easy as possible for the grantees to get the work? The metaphor that I used was the difference in self-check-in at the airport, which is relatively easy, and self-checkout at the grocery store, which is so hard, especially when you get to fruit, right? And then one of the other conversations we are having is eradicating blind reviews, because that was designed as an equitable tool, but we now know that it is the opposite of that. It is inequitable. And then having set disciplines in our artist category. I think there are too many hybrid artists, and the set disciplines also still others, people like drag queens and street artists and DJs, which I think are part of the cultural sector. And also people that work in the cultural sector that maybe don't define themselves as artists, like light hangers and backstage crew and house managers, who are paying their taxes, who also deserve grant money, who also need grant money. So we're having those kinds of conversations. I think this is the last slide, right? Yeah, questions?
So incredible. Thank you so much, Michael. So the first thing I wrote down that you said, one of many things I wrote down today, was a statement that I want to make a mantra for the public sector. We're here to fund the sector, not the best of, right? Thank you so much for so succinctly and powerfully making that statement. And incidentally, congratulations on a tremendous amount of achievement in a year and a half. And I would add that this work has been outward facing, and Michael and his team have accountability measures online so that folks can track how the work is going, which also is a part of building the trust, right? The tracking, the accountability, anyone can be a part of that. So I have a question for you. And a year and a half in, I'm happy to ask this question because it's about navigating the tremendous authorizing environment that you find yourself within in a government agency, because certainly navigating that environment is critical for success. And so could you tell us a little bit about how you did that? Were there some folks you needed to win over, for example? Were there some folks you needed to bring into the effort? How'd you do that?
Well, I think the inclusion and the agency of it from the beginning was a good tool. And I learned this from my fundraising practices. What's the term? You ask someone for advice, they give you money. You ask them for money, they give you advice. And so we engaged a lot of people that we thought maybe would have problems with this from the very beginning. Certainly quoting the leadership of the country and the state, and also pinning those other agencies was a help. And oddly enough, Pam, we've not gotten any negative response. There was one sort of blog from some weird white supremacist person that has no connection to Massachusetts that we saw, but we have not gotten any like negative feedback on this, only positive feedback. We did, after we launched the plan, we did go on somewhat of a virtual tour to share it with legislators and do webinars and go through the plan with them in detail so that we can get their buy-in. But so far, so good. We'll see how it goes as we continue executing the action steps and where people feel like they are losing out to see what happens. But so far, it's been really good. The other mantra I wanted to share with you quickly is that we do have as we're doing the review of our grants, we do have a mantra called equity wins. That if we discover that there's something that we're doing that is inequitable, it is going away. It is going to change. And there's not a conversation about do we change it or not, because if we discover that something is inequitable and we decide to keep it, what does that say about us, right? So it is changing. Equity wins, it's changing. The only work we need to do is to help that program officer or that staff member understand why it's changing so that they don't repeat the same mistake when they come up with a new policy or rule. So thank you for the note about we're here to fund the sector, not the best of.
I love it. And I'm just going to go out on a limb here and suggest that probably my take would be the reason resistance has been down is because the public facing aspect of every part of the process has been strong. And so when more people have a voice, right, and more people believe that their voice counts, right, I think that that builds the groundwork for less
Trust.
resistance, for trust.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's certainly the case.
Thanks.
Other questions?
We're going to loop around at the end, though, so we will have more questions. And I'm so grateful, Michael, that you took this time with us, and I'm so glad that we're going to be able to engage you a little bit more. Let me go ahead and add Ryan to the mix. There we are. Okay, Ryan, let's go ahead and get you set up.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Eddie. And I'd like to start off with grateful thanks to Grantmakers in the Arts for the invitation to share the story that I get to share with you today, and for all y'all's work behind the scenes. And what a privilege to be able to connect with and learn from my colleagues, Tariana and Michael. I'm so excited to continue the conversations that we've started today. A lot of overlap. As Eddie said, my name is Ryan Coons, and I'm Folk Life Specialist at the Maryland State Arts Council, or MSAC. I'm sure I will mention that acronym way too many times this afternoon. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a white settler, cisgendered, gay, bald man with a mustache. And since my presentation focuses on traditional tribal lands and land acknowledgements, I'll actually save mine for the end. Perhaps unusually for an arts administrator, I actually come to this work with a doctorate in ethnomusicology, which is the cultural study of music. And I have a background in Indigenous studies that I was very fortunate to learn primarily through the tutelage of tribal elders in a Muskogee Creek tribal town. And at MSAC, I administer grant programs through Maryland Traditions, which is our traditional arts program. And I'm excited to share with you this, this broader story of MSAC's Land Acknowledgement Project, which took a nothing for us without us approach and deepened relationships with tribal peoples whose lands are claimed by Maryland. The project also resulted in a public resource on land acknowledgements available for free to the public. And to my surprise, our project jump-started a series of newly formed coalitions that are taking the ideas of the project and moving forward in new and exciting directions. And I recommend this project as a model that combats Indigenous erasure and builds networks that promote Indigenous sovereignty, and that begin to facilitate the development of ethical relationships between primarily settler institutions and tribal peoples. So in my spiel right now, I'm going to kind of start with an overview of land acknowledgement statements so that we're all on the same page, discuss how our project evolved, and then move into an overview of the ways in which people have taken the ideas from the project and moved forward with them in new and exciting directions. And having given you kind of this overview and background, I'll conclude by sharing with you the statewide land acknowledgement statement, so it becomes a little more meaningful, I hope. Slide, please. In case you're not already familiar with them, land acknowledgements are statements that recognize Indigenous peoples dispossessed of their lands and relationships with land by settler colonists. And these statements bring attention to the tribal peoples who are, and in certain circumstances, were once local to the lands that settler colonists and institutions currently occupy. And they are really a minor way to acknowledge Indigenous sovereignty. And at least within the place now known as Maryland, they're useful to correct the inaccurate impression that Native peoples no longer live locally. There are many different ways to create and deliver them. It can include reading it at the beginning of an event, placing it in program notes, publishing it in public spaces, placing it within public artworks, posting it online. These statements are a growing social justice practice, popular especially in arts and cultural heritage contexts in the United States. And they're a practice that is particularly appropriate for settler and other non-Indigenous peoples to do. Slide, please. So as a government agency that values transparency, requests from our constituents, which is to say Maryland residents, chart the course that MSAC takes, and the MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project was no exception. Over the past 2 years, we've received more than 50 requests, a very large number of requests from Maryland-based independent artists and from organizations inside and outside the arts sector for information on land acknowledgements, how to create and deliver them, and information on American Indian peoples in Maryland. 2 virtual webinars that we presented on land acknowledgements in 2020 and in 2021 attracted pretty high for MSAC events. And as of this month, post-event views of over 800, which is the largest, again, among the largest audience attendance numbers and view numbers of any of our events. So in response to these numerous requests, staff from Maryland Traditions established an MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project, specifically in consultation with previous American Indian grantees and in consultation with the administrator of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, which functions both to support tribal peoples and their goals in the state, and also functions as a kind of a clearinghouse connecting tribes with government agencies and non-government agencies. And we really had 3 goals. First, to work to undo Indigenous erasure, which is the phenomenon through which Indigenous peoples are disappeared, so to speak, in polite parlance, disappeared from landscapes and narratives. Second goal, to deepen relationships between tribal peoples living in Maryland and MSAC, specifically to increase funding going into Indian country in Maryland. And third, to create that publicly accessible series of land acknowledgement statements and resources. And we thought this project would last maybe 3 months. And we started in April 2020, my second month on the job, and we published the public materials in February 2022. So our original schedule was way off the mark. In the project, staff researched best practices for delivering land acknowledgement statements and engaged in compensated consultations between January and December 2021 with tribal leaders and elders in American Indian tribes whose lands are claimed by Maryland. And these include the Akahanik Indian Tribe, Assateague Peoples Tribe, Choptico Band of Indians, Nasuewash Band of Indians, Piscataway Indian Nation, Pocomoke Indian Nation, Susquehannock Indians, and the Youghiogheny River Band of Shawnee. And we were very privileged because tribal consultants included kind of the who's who of Indigenous Maryland, including 7 current or former chiefs, tribal chairs or tribal speakers, 6 tribal historians or preservation officers, numerous tradition bearers, current and former commissioners from the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs, a retired employee from the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and a former federal commissioner of Indian Affairs. And I should note, tribes were not required to participate and declined to take part in the project, directly exercising their sovereignty rights. And also very important to note, the consultants received fiscal compensation for their labor and their time. I mentioned earlier that our original timeframe of 3 months stretched into 2 years, and this primarily occurred because of the need and importance of developing relationships with tribal leaders and elders. And this very much speaks to some of the things that my colleague Tariana spoke about earlier during today's webinar. Ethically, we couldn't simply send leaders or tribal leaders and elders Google Calendar invitations to a consultation, and that was it. Which is really laughable now that I've said that out loud. But instead of that, kind of short version that is literally impossible, I spent most of 2020 connecting with tribal leaders, sharing the idea and goals of the project with them, and then inviting them to consider participating. Never just one single conversation with anyone involved, with any tribe involved. And in some instances, I actually spent a lot of time working to find out how to contact tribal leaders in the first place. And very much can speak to Tariana's notes earlier that this relationship building was a primary reason for the success of the project. As I think all three of us have spoken about today, historical traumas and the many tactics that compromise specific to this project, indigenous erasure and genocide, mean that Native peoples have very few reasons to trust representatives of any US government, even government employees in so seemingly innocuous an agency as the State Arts Council. So it was a genuine pleasure to receive responses from tribal leaders and elders saying that they would like to participate in the project. Slide, please. Following consultation, Maryland Tradition staff compiled information received during the consultations in what we call the Land Acknowledgement Project Overview and Resource Guide document. And if you want to follow along, you can access this document at the URL listed on this screen, or you can scan the QR code also listed on this slide. They all direct to msac.org/resources/land-acknowledgements. And this document features explanations of best practices for creating and delivering land acknowledgements. It contains tribal histories and maps. And it also contains land acknowledgement statements, many of which have been created by tribal leadership for the lands of each of the tribes who consulted on the project. A key concepts section also contains important culturally specific information that can help constituents more easily create land acknowledgements, and also contains answers to many questions that we've received from constituents during the project. And I like to refer to this section as Indigenous Studies 101. It's a really good crash course. There's also an additional resources section that provides a brief annotated list of books, articles, and archival collections featuring information on land acknowledgements, on tribal peoples whose lands are claimed by Maryland, and again on Indigenous studies. And most importantly, tribal consultants reviewed the document for cultural accuracy, and they approved it. And again, because we are a state agency, any public-facing anything has to also go through a series of internal reviews, which it did, and passed reviews internally by staff, reviews by our Assistant Attorney General, reviews by our parent agency, the Maryland Department of Commerce, and an unusual, not always required, but in this instance, required review by staff in the Office of the Governor of Maryland. And it passed each one of those, occasionally to my surprise. Slide, please. Now, similar to what Tariana shared earlier, here again, there exists this constant tension in the practice of creating and delivering land acknowledgement. There's first kind of the importance of engaging in the practice, and simultaneously the recognition that land acknowledgements are performative and problematic, and they function best as a beginning and not as an end goal. And far too often, land acknowledgements are exclusively performative. They're a lot of hot air and nothing more. In June 2021, Maryland Traditions hosted a webinar entitled Land Acknowledgement 2.0, in which a number of tribal consultants in the MSAC project shared their perspectives on actions that non-Indigenous people can make to move beyond that performativity. And I've listed a few of the highlights here on the screen for you to peruse at your leisure. I'd like to note, of course, that the most important one is, to my mind, the eventual return of land to tribes, which is something that we heard from every single tribe we consulted with in one way or another. Now, since these project materials were made public, Maryland residents really continue to pleasantly surprise me with the ways they are working to move beyond that performativity. I know it's inevitable that there's going to be a portion of institutions and peoples who access our materials say, oh, great, we've got an institutional land acknowledgement now. Box checked. It's inevitable. But we've found that land acknowledgements appear to be something of a gateway drug, if I can repurpose that metaphor. They're a very effective conversation starter towards broader and more practical action. And our project has resulted in the formation of several coalitions that are currently working on projects either initiated by tribal peoples and or deemed worthwhile by tribal peoples. Now, some of these, but not all, but some of these relationships derived from connections that were made during a project follow-up convening that we hosted just this past December in order to connect tribal consultants with staff and resources in state and other agencies, specifically in response to tribal consultant questions that they made of MSA series during the consultations. One of these kind of resulting projects focuses on curricula in Maryland public schools and is working to connect tribal people with the tools they need to write their own curricula for use in public schools, and also to connect educators with local tribal peoples and resources to bring contemporary tribal perspectives into schools. Another project connects tribal elders and leaders to the Maryland State Archives, where staff are working to centralize all historic records relating to tribal peoples in an online searchable database. And speaking as an archivist, that is a massive and difficult undertaking, and it's quite exciting that they plan to have a public version available by later this summer. It's no small thing there. And a third coalition of arts organizations and higher ed institutions are seeking to use the process of creating respective institutional land acknowledgement statements, specifically to develop relationships with tribes in order to make their own institutional resources available to the tribes. So in something of a summary and kind of in reviewing this project, I have to say I'm exceedingly grateful that we started when we did. As you all know, the initial COVID lockdown in 2020 required us all to make an enormous series of adjustments, including that larger shift to working virtually. And that move really made this project possible. I honestly hypothesized that had we been working with the in-person expectations of the pre-COVID world, the project would barely be a third completed now, if that. And that move to prioritize virtual communication out of necessity at the time, of course, allowed us to be able to connect with tribal people who are widely geographically dispersed. Slide, please. I just said all that. I apologize. I'm a little behind myself. There we go. Thank you so much, Eddie. So I'd like to close now, having given you something of a broader foundation of what they are and why they can be important and how they can be made meaningful as a start. I want to share with you this land acknowledgement statement that was authored by a Chaptico elder for the project. It's one of the more powerful land acknowledgement statements that we've been able to include in project materials, and it makes a very specific indigenous perspective on the interconnections between land and the people living on it. And it takes that worldview and makes it a lot more comprehensible to folks who might otherwise be unfamiliar with tribal worldviews. And it reads as follows. We acknowledge the lands and waters now known as Maryland are the home of its first peoples, the Accohannock Indian Tribe, Assateague Peoples Tribe, Cedarville Band of Piscataway Indians, Choctaw Band of Indians, Lenape Tribe, Nanticoke Tribe, Nassau-Wawash Band of Indians, Piscataway Conoy Tribe, Piscataway Indian Nation, Pocomoke Indian Nation, Susquehannock Indians, Youghiogheny River Band of Shawnee, and tribes in the Chesapeake watershed who have seemingly vanished since the coming of colonialism. We acknowledge that this land is now home to other tribal peoples living here in diaspora. We acknowledge the forced removal of many from the lands and waterways that nurtured them as kin. We acknowledge the degradation that continues to be wrought on the land and waters in pursuit of resources. We acknowledge the right of the land and waterways to heal so that they can continue to provide food and medicine for all. We acknowledge that it is our collective obligation to pursue policies and practices that respect the land and waters so that our reciprocal relationship with them can be fully restored. Thank you.
Brian, my heart is beating so fast, so much faster than it was before you began, because I'm so excited about this work.
Thank you, Pam. That's so kind of you.
Oh, it's true. And I have to say that based upon the response within the state that you're already beginning to receive. It's now feeling like you're at the beginning of a movement. You know, I don't know if that was the intention, but it sounds like a movement, right?
I hope so. I sincerely hope so.
So thanks for that. Thanks for that work. Thanks also for the short and equally important, nothing for us without us.
Nothing
Again,
for us
something I
without us.
wrote down really quickly. And so very important to be front of mind, I think, in work with Indigenous peoples and on behalf of Indigenous peoples. I want to also say that for me, your presence here is emblematic of not just an amazing project, right, that has the potential to change how so many of your constituents engage or help them begin to engage, right, with Indigenous communities, but also for me, you're emblematic here of the fact that important power to advance equity can come from any place in any of our organizations, right? You don't have to be the executive director, and the power you brought, right, and realized in the agency was so critical for this work. So, and I think that's important because the folks who are going to connect to this action lab, this cultural policy action lab, come from many places in organizations, and it's important for them to be inspired by you. So thank you. Also, I have one question for you as well before we move on. And the question is in the space of all of the circumstances that come into play when we in public agencies try to embark upon this kind of work, because the circumstances are varied to help us be successful, right, in this work. So what circumstances created the opportunity for you to be able to actually advance this work? Like what allowed you to get to do this work now and to do it successfully? Because already we're feeling the success, we're seeing the impact and the movement begin. So what are the circumstances that you think helped that get you to where you are now?
That is such a fantastic and difficult to answer question, actually, I have to say. I confess no small part of it was luck. I come to this work, this is my second or third career shift in almost as many years into arts admin, and I absolutely love it. I finally found my niche, but I have a very unusual skill set. It's unusual for arts administrators to have been college professors, to have done qualitative ethnographic field research with tribal peoples over decades. That's just weird. But it also means that I come to this work with a skill set that I can employ. And before I had my current position as folklife specialist, I was actually the processing archivist of the Maryland Traditions Archives, which is our repository housed at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County with special collections there. And their institution was working on a land acknowledgement. And me kind of being the, as close to an in-house expert as they were able to get, the conversations really started there. And we realized, hey, there's really nothing statewide. Hey, Native peoples are in Maryland. That's a really revolutionary thing to still say because they've been erased so damn thoroughly because of all of the colonial history. And I frankly think also because that little thing called the national capital is in our backyard. With all of its myth making and myth maintaining. But there was so much that we didn't know, and tribal peoples have been so thoroughly erased that to be able to take my skill set into my current job and say, hey, let's do something with this. We've got a mandate. So many people are asking questions. So many people want materials and resources. We're one of the few state agencies that actually have those relationships. I mentioned our previous Indigenous grantees. There are not many state agencies that have been working with the tribal peoples in Maryland, bar, of course, the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs. So the fact that we actually had any relationships to begin with, to build that trust with other tribes, combined with the luck of the pandemic, there was no silver linings in COVID, but that move to virtual made a lot of things possible here. That combined with sheer luck.
Well, and the right work, centering the right people.
Very much so. And again, I might be the administrator of this project on paper, but it would not be possible without those relationships.
Right.
Tribal folks that we communicated with and continue to build relationships with decided that it was something that they wanted to see done. They decided that it was something that they wanted to put time, very limited time, I should add, and effort into. And, you know, even though we paid them, probably not what anyone's worth, but even though we paid them for their time, especially during COVID, especially tribal communities have very limited resources and time and labor. So it's a testament to the potential power in this project that they deemed it appropriate and worthwhile.
Right. Wow. Powerful work. And I want to be evangelical about it. I think it's
Thank you.
Really, really important. So along the same lines of, what circumstance created the opportunity for you to do this work? Tatiana, I'd ask you the same question. Are there some particular circumstances that help to sort of create the space for you to do the work that you're doing now?
I mean, I think if I ask anyone in this virtual room, if this was work that you started doing when it became the thing, maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago, probably everybody would say, no, it's been part of how I do my work forever, right? I mean, it's been part of who I am and my professional career. But as I said, I had done it very quietly. At times it felt even subversive. So I think for me is, and I love how Michael and Ryan both, I love how Michael brought the idea of aggressive, because if there's something, I know myself and I'm not very patient. And Ryan bringing back the relationship piece. When we come back, it's really all centered in humanness and relationship in terms of the work that we do. I think for me was just feeling, going back, and I'll never forget, this is back in around 2012, I went to some conference and I saw this people on the stage that were on a panel, and they were talking about this equity work as if it was like the most innovative and new thing in the world. And I remember thinking, really? Like, maybe, yes, maybe new in this space and talking about it. But for me, it felt like I've been doing this forever. I just have not been talking about the walk, right? So I think for me, I'll never forget, I went back, and at the time I went to our executive director, who I definitely owe a lot in terms of a white, straight man who came from corporate on an international level. The fact that he was so self-assured and so self-aware of what he didn't know and he, was in his place, that I went to him and I said, we can either lead or stay behind. And basically, I put him on the spot and I said, I want a budget line item. And the budget line item was more of making a point of saying, especially in government budgets, that says everything, that basically leads, how you're going to implement. And I said, I want a budget line item. And I said, I don't know what that means in terms of the actions, but I need you to trust me. And he did. So as with many of us, of course, it was not part of my job description. Of course, it was not something that was listed as a to-do, but it became, as I was able to take that, and I was lucky that I had somebody that was willing to take that risk in government and was willing to let me lead in that way. And then years later, when the mayor came and said, I have an equity platform I want to present, it's a good thing I have a good relationship with the mayor, because I said, Mayor, this is fantastic. My train left the station a long time ago. So I'm glad, and, use me as you wish, right? I'm here, but I just need to make that point. So I think at times, especially in our spaces, it's never been, at least as far as I know, it was never organized. It was never part of something that had been built before. It just took guts, right? It just took, and just knowing that I didn't know how else to do my work. And when I saw, those people on a panel talking about how new it was, there was something in me that I said, it's not new. And as a person of color, as a person that has lived in the margins, no, we don't know any other way. So yeah, I think it took just taking a risk. And thankfully, I was very lucky. To Ryan, I was lucky. I was very lucky.
Well, there's luck and there's wisdom in also taking advantage of moments. And I would imagine that along the entire trajectory, along the journey, you look to take advantage of moments.
Yes, I think you
Yes.
probably all have.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
Well, Michael, I'd ask the same of you. Is there something in particular that allowed you or opened the gate for you to do this work now?
Well, living life as a Black man in America is extremely motivating. Having to deal with these things every day of your life it can wear on you. And oddly enough, when Mass Cultural Council came a call-in, I was running a theater, and so I remember telling the search firm, "No, I just want to make plays. Just let me make plays for the rest of my life." And then I realized that this is important work, and I have some skill and expertise. I've been doing racial equity training before it became fashionable, and similar to Tariana, in a subversive way. But this job gave me a platform to do it in a way that could affect, the whole sector in Massachusetts and maybe have an effect on other states across the union. The last thing I will say is it comes from a place of gratitude, because I know that one of the reasons why I sit in this position is because somebody did some equity work back in the late 1900s when I was a little boy in school, and gave me the opportunity to study the arts in my very underfunded DC public schools. And so, I think about all the little Michael Bobbitts that live out there that may not have access to this. And so I feel a strong push to make sure they all have support and art in their lives, because what is the world missing out on when they don't get it? So yeah, those are the main motivating factors.
Thanks, appreciate that. I'd like to end my questions with one for Ryan, and this is one that Tariana spoke to earlier, as did Michael, around navigating different levels of power. There are people who can stop this work, right? And unfortunately, that happens and is happening in places across the country. And some of us experience resistance in this space. And I noticed, Ryan, earlier in your comments, you spoke to really advancing the work all the way up to the governor's office, right? Because approval for this work at those levels, that was essential. And so I'm curious, did you experience any resistance? Did you find allies you didn't expect would be allies?
I expected to experience resistance at every single level. I did. Again, I come into this work with a scholastic background, and I know the histories. I know how many people have said no. And I'm still genuinely shocked that we did not ping at some point in that series of approvals. Again, the fact that I think, honestly, the reason that we didn't get pinged, especially by the Attorney General's office, by our Assistant Attorney General, who has to review everything, or by the staff in the governor's office. I think, honestly, the reason that they said, yes, let's go ahead with this, is that this was in very clear, direct response to very clearly phrased requests from constituents. Hey, we want resources on. And that's what this is. It's a resource on this practice, this hot air, meaningless little practice that does actually have the power to start conversations. I'm very fortunate in my executive directors. Both the one that I started the project under and our current executive director have been extremely supportive. My supervisor has been extremely supportive of it. And I know that I think both executive directors went to bat with our department secretary, who is a good job as a secretary, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they have any background or knowledge of Indigenous studies or land acknowledgements. Many of the folks that we had to get to approve this had never heard of them before. So it's this constant act. I think Tariana and Michael, you both spoke to this, the importance of having that script, as Tariana said, but also in advocating for yourself and educating at the same time. Hey, this is what this is. This is why it's important. This is why we're doing this. Please check this box to approve it. And they did.
You know, I think that one of the many things the three of you have sort of evidenced for me is the importance of how deeply you are people first in public practice, right? I think there are too many public agencies. We're not talking about arts agencies, right, at the moment. I'm just talking about public agencies in general, but too many agencies that, you know, at the end of whatever it is they want to create for policy change, something goes in the newspaper or online, folks have no idea they have an opportunity to comment, and it's public outreach, right? So I think what you've embodied internally inside your agencies, as well as externally across various levels of stakeholders, constituents, and power, is fundamentally the best of what government could and should be, right? In cooperation with the people we serve, right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's what makes government powerful and responsive to the actual needs of folks. And I think the three of you have embodied that beautifully in your work. And perhaps that's one of the reasons you're not seeing the amount of resistance maybe other agencies see that that aren't so genuinely focused, right, on the people first. And I have a boss from some years ago who I went to an idea with in state government, in fact, in Louisiana. And he asked me a question about whether or not I socialized the idea. And at the time, I hadn't really thought about a government idea in the context of socialization. And I would say that y'all internally and externally have socialized the work really powerfully. And it's an important part to building success along the journey. So thanks for all of that work. And Eddie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. I basically just wanted to ask if you had any questions for one another. I see you nodding, Ryan, please.
I actually have a question for both Tariana and for Michael, two different questions. Tariana, you mentioned at one point during your presentation the importance of building relationships. And I'm curious if you could kind of drill down a little deeper into the actual practical day-to-day. How do y'all go about the actual relationship building? What does that look like, boots on the ground?
That's a great question. And I'll start by saying that this has been a humbling journey. I'm a highly self-critical person. I want to be, I want to please. I want to be, And so when you make that commitment to really get into relationship, and no matter what, you're hoping to become the trusted outsider as government, because no matter what, we are still government. It is difficult because you got to get ready to hear. And many times you're going to hear things that feel hurtful. And again, if I'm a highly self-critical, high sensitive person, so it has felt hurtful at times. And I've had to take a step back and say, okay, this is what the work is about, and how do I respond to that? So I would say that in terms of the relationship, specifically the relationship piece, is we already had a group of relationships to be. We had grantee partners, we had artists that had, we had commissioned public art for, right? We were surrounded by relationships to be. So I think a lot started by literally taking a moment and slowing down and starting to have conversations with those grantee partners that were not, they were not about the dollars, that were not about the expectations as funders, but were more about acknowledging and honoring their work It was about letting them know that I very much knew my role, my role was to elevate them, that the honor was mine to be able to use this platform to bring attention to the work that they are doing day in and out, that the one benefiting was me in getting to know how the work is done within community. So it was really about just taking a very humbling approach to meeting this potential, again, relationships. And then, as I said in my statement, taking the time. I mean, I always joke that it took so many coffees, it took so many visits, right? In which the outcome, there was no outcome beyond the moment. And those were times that, again, I spent, more than a year before I said, I have an idea. What do you think, if you were to partner with us, what would that look like? Tell me, what would that look like? And that's an approach that I think that then I would also give permission, and I say this very intentionally, to my team to say, I am expecting you to schedule and spend time in building relationship. It's not about, once that check gets out, I hope that you've had the conversations to work with them on application, to work with them to getting them, to know them. And it's about then in the implementation, either just step back and let them do, and also say, I'm here. How can I, support any challenges? So now it's very much a part of the team's work that, applications are received, decisions are made, and then there's a year in which they're just working and building relationship with all of those grantee partners. And those are the stories worth telling. So I think a lot of it, and the other thing, I think the Human Rights and Community Partnerships Commissions, those are community people. They were critical, Ryan, to our land acknowledgement, which every time we do it, I get calls, can we use it? Can we use it? And I'm always thinking, thank you, sure. But let me tell you about the fact that this land acknowledgement took close to 2 years to create. It was a collaborative process. It was really about coming together with that group of community members from the American Indian Commission, all indigenous people that, again, that very much came together to support us. So I think it's really about time. It's about vulnerability. It's about ownership, and about truly just acknowledging the power, the privilege, and how to be humble about it. Because I also am very aware, right, that I'm the first person of color in leadership in the history of this agency, right? So I'm still very much surrounded by, others that do not look like me. So for me, I do this work. This work is definitely not about me. It's about not just community, but about those that I'm hoping that I've opened doors so that they can step into this space that that no one had been able to do that right before. And I'm the first, and there's a lot of pressure and that comes with that. And I honor that every day. I'm very, very aware of the responsibilities. So
I would add to that, and I hate to think in terms of operationalizing things, but I do think that the funding world is so marred in best practices that don't include things like cultivation and that sort of thing. So to use the tools that they have created to your advantage to get that kind of work done. And so program officers just don't know how to cultivate relationships. They just don't have the experience or the training. So we're operationalizing it. We're using, as Tariana mentioned, referrals. from other grantees, individual artists, other state agencies, leaders in multicultural communities. The BIPOC outreach coordinators that we hired comes from a tool I started using 5 years ago called consensus organizing, where you hire someone from that community to organize that community because there's comfort in someone who is familiar. It takes multiple touches to build trust. So oftentimes program officers will send one email and then stop there. And so now their job is to like follow up with a phone call, get a meeting, budgeting for those coffees and those networking events. And we're beta testing a bunch of things coming up this year. We have a couple of things we're calling pop-ups, where we're gonna do multicultural pop-up events to share with the community that we haven't been funding, the things that we're doing and how to build relationships. And then because I have eradicated formalized required evaluations, they are gone, no more. We're actually going to beta test our first regional site visit, where all of us are going to go to a region. We're going to shut down the office for a day and we're going to site visit our asses off. But none of it is going to be evaluative. It's all going to be about relationships. And so I'm kind of excited about some of those things that we're testing out and trying. But I'm using the tools of operationalizing it to and having measurable so that people actually will include it as part of their job and not something that they do when they have time.
I have a former mentor who really got through my thick skull the idea that those of us who are in positions of power are by default gatekeepers. And his philosophy was always hold the gate open. Don't hold it closed, hold it open. And I think that a lot of where I've kind of been trying to put my own perspective as someone in whatever power I have just by virtue of being a state bureaucrat, it's this idea that I have the power to hold gates to funding open. So let's try to do that to as many people as possible. And thank you both for weighing in on that. There's some very practical advice there. Thanks.
Well, and I love what I think both of you mentioned at some point. You know, we're so used to the apply, which means we're sitting back and waiting. Oh, but we're making it so easy. Apply. And that's just half. Of course, we want, people to, but if they don't even know, if they don't feel comfortable, right, is apply and recruit. And I think we've all used a lot of that, use that word a lot, recruit in terms of grants, in terms of jobs, in terms of, it is our job to get off our seats and recruit and facilitate and support. And I think I'm all for operationalizing, Michael. So because I'm thinking when I leave, what is left is, if you haven't operationalized it, it leaves with me, right? So you have to embed it in the process so that it becomes the process, and then it's beyond you. And how important that is, and how also important it is. I mean, I think all of us are doing the work very much human-centered, but how important is data, how important is so that we can see clearly where we are. It's like, if we don't know where we are, we don't know then what we need to do. And I would say that was one of the hardest things for people to not feel afraid of what they would learn through data. But without it, I think, that has informed a lot of the decisions that we have made internally, just knowing that, we're doing pretty good with the Latino community. Whoa, we have big gaps with the disability and the Native community. Knowing that and seeing that, it's, and it's not about feeling bad. It's about, okay, we got it. Then what are we going to do about it? Don't get data for the sake of getting data. It's what are you going to do with that data, right? How is it going to inform what you do? How are you going to share, both in terms of trust, the wins, and then the areas that, my God, we need to do better, right? So I appreciate both of you really talking about both the human part of things, but also the fact that when you work in government, it's about process, it's about systems, and how do we then make sure that it becomes a new system? Because we will not be there forever, right? So thank you for bringing that human side of things to process and systems and government.
I'm gonna call you about the offboarding of final reports because it is such a scary thing for the staff.
Ooh,
And I'm like, why is it so scary? It's less work. Just
for the auditors, woo, final reports.
Yeah, so I'm gonna call you about that.
Can I be part of that conversation, please?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, and Tatiana, thanks for bringing it to data, because something I was going to mention earlier, and you segued beautifully, is relationship building is obviously critical. And to what end? If an agency is not preparing itself to live up to the promise of work with and benefit for and resources for these previously under or unserved communities, then relationships crumble, right? And so the data is a tool to help to realize, help an agency realize living up to the promise. Got to be able to live it.
Right. I mean, it's about accountability, but the way I see it is also about, it's about a commitment, a promise, right? I mean, for me is the moment we say as an agency, where there is a part of the plan, I think Michael and Ryan both, you mentioned very particular steps and very particular ways in which you're going to show accountability on the website. I mean, transparency, all of that, which, is all about government, right? Transparency is so critical in government. Yes, exactly. Big air quotes, I think I try to bring that human-centered approach by saying the moment we state something is a promise, right? And a promise, it equals commitment. So how are we committed to these values, right? How, what does it mean to make a commitment to these values and to show accountability through that? So I really appreciate both Ryan and Michael, you really showing those very specific ways in which you are showing that commitment and that promise to your community.
So that was beautiful. I could listen to you for the rest of the day, but we've been together for 2 hours and I'm so sorry that we're going to have to wrap it up. I am so grateful. Ryan Coons from Maryland State Arts Council, Michael J. Bobbitt from Mass Cultural Council, Dariana Navas-Nieves from Denver Arts and Venues. Thank you so much for lending your perspectives to this discussion. It has been great.
Thank you for bringing us together. I feel like I just made 2 new friends. I really do. So expect we need to kind of come together and share war stories and tricks and all of that good stuff. So thank you, Eddie and Pam and Randy, who's I know behind the scenes, for bringing us together. It's been a gift to me. So thank you.
1,000 moments of gratitude. Thank you all so much.
Echoed by me as well. Thanks so much to each of you. State arts agencies and local arts agencies are such critical parts of the arts ecosystem, and witnessing how you're advancing this work is humbling, and it's exciting. So thank you so much.
I also want to thank the team behind Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series, Jen Cole from Pacific Northwest College of Art at Willamette University, Randy Engstrom from Third Way Creative, and Estrella Esquilin from Santa Fe Art Institute. Thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you all.
Thank you.
The Cultural Policy Action Lab and Learning Series is a leadership and professional development.
Hi, everybody. That was incredible. First of all, thank you to Eddie, to Pam, to Tatiana, to Ryan, to Michael. Totally inspiring. And we did want to carve out a number of folks are here. Tatiana, Ryan, Eddie were able to join us today. So we did want to leave a little bit of space if there was some discussion we wanted to have in real time. I'll start by just pulling a few threads that really stood out to me. First of all, that was like a mic drop event. Like it just, the gems just kept coming, and it was really powerful. I really love how each of you in your practice, all 5 presenters, talk about moving from and towards. You ground your practice in what has come before, but you're very clearly moving towards more equitable systems, more responsive, more human-centered systems. Tatiana, I like that example at the end about applying versus recruiting, and we can't just sit back and wait for everyone to come to us. So many nuanced points about navigating authorizing environments, and you each of you work at different levels of different agencies of different size and structure. All of you offered really brilliant wisdom around how those advocacy, how that work might be, how you might navigate those authorizing environments. The reality of moving at the speed of trust and how it takes time to build trust in a community, and people don't trust the government, and they have really good reasons not to trust the government. That's like an inherent thing that every public sector employee just is wearing like a backpack full of rocks all the time. And so to actually overcome that is really important, and to know it. Tatiana, you said something about not being afraid of what the data will tell us, not being afraid of the gaps. We have to be honest about where we've made mistakes so we can own those mistakes and correct our course for the future. I love how action-oriented this is. That, you know, Ryan, I'm so glad that you were able to do such a lovely dive into all of the resources you have around land acknowledgements and Indigenous relationships, because as we tried to frame at the beginning of this presentation, we can get lost in land acknowledgements and they can become performative. And how do we get beyond the performance? How do we get to where real power and agency can be restored to those host nations and First Nation communities? The need of sort of socializing this work, of building relationships, and through those relationships advancing equity. I just love, Michael said repeatedly, of operationalizing, and this idea of operationalizing relationships is something you're going to hear, I think, through every single session. Ryan, I love your point about when the gate open. May we all stand at the gates and hold them open for as long as we can until everyone is inside. And lastly, I'll just say, I know a number of our cohort members from the Cultural Policy Action Lab, the national cohort that we're convening in the alternating weeks of this series, really were able to speak to the value of a community of practice. I really want to thank GIA, Eddie, and Nadia, who's also here and should have introduced at the beginning of this program. Sorry, Nadia, love you very much. GIA has invested in this work. GIA is creating a space for a community of practice in the public sector. And that doesn't happen very often. And you could hear it in that video where Tatiana, Ryan, and Michael started creating a community sort of in real time with Eddie and Pam. It's definitely what we've seen happen with the cohort already, with only a couple of meetings underway. So just gratitude for all of your brilliance, gratitude for demonstrating what we hope this program would offer people, because this is an experiment and we've never done it before. And so much gratitude for GIA, their ongoing partnership and friendship and relationship is super valuable. And Tatiana and I have the great privilege of also being board members of that organization. So super awesome. I'm happy to be quiet and let Tatiana, Ryan, or Eddie reflect on anything that you heard today. Or if we do have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Feel free to flag them for us. And finally, I'll just say one thing and then I'll be quiet. Our next session is July 7th. That's 2 weeks from July 6th. That's 2 Wednesdays from today. We will be joined by David Holland from the Western States Arts Federation and Cezanne Charles from Root of Two, and they're going to be exploring placemaking, placekeeping, and infrastructure. Jen put a great description of that in the chat earlier. I also want to give a huge shout out to Estrella Esquilin, who's like choreographing all of this on the tech side in the background, and is such a brilliant collaborator and partner to this project too. So Michael can't answer questions because he is on his well-deserved honeymoon. Shout out to Love. But anyone else is available to answer questions. Also, it's kind of like we just ate like a 6-course meal and maybe we just need to like take a nap and like process. That's okay too. But wanted to leave the space open. And with that, I'll be quiet.
Just wanted to jump in with the question, and that is in the Q&A because obviously he's not here, and they're working on that equity index. There are other available that you can use, and even though that for us in Denver, we do not, I guess, call it an equity index, we have very particular questions on applications for our funding and our grant programs that allow us to evaluate an organization's commitment and operationalizing of equity. And there are just some key questions that focused on not just, do you have a plan? Do you have your goals? Do you have a statement of commitment? But what is the makeup of your board, of your staff, leadership, and how do you operationalize equity? How is it reflected in your programming, in your decision making? So there's some key questions that we use that allow us to then evaluate an organization based on that. Just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Tariana. And I just wanted to check with the folks who are with us in the audience, if anybody had any questions, if you'd like to just unmute yourself and ask a question of Tariana or Ryan. Right, please raise your hand to unmute.
Ashley Firestone.
Hello, thank you all so much. This has been incredibly inspiring. As I was listening to the conversations about authority and about engaging stakeholders at high levels throughout government, the other piece that I wanted to ask about is whether any of you have anything to share about engaging stakeholders at the staff level and sort of from the bottom to the top and pushing up and pushing down. And if there's anything you might want to add about engaging at those levels as well.
I can jump in. So with regards to staff, I think it's important for staff to, I would say the first thing is to establish trust. And I recommend, it's a program called 5 Behaviors of a Cohesive Team. And it's all around building trust within your team. So I think that's the first step. And once you get there, then you can have the more difficult conversations that are inherent with talking about equity and race. And I think it's also important to define what operationalizing equity means for each individual staff member. And that means having a one-on-one. For us, is part of their annual evaluation. But what does it mean if you're a grant administrator versus if you are the person that is handling our catering versus the person that is in finance? So I think for me, it's been very helpful to get very granular as to what it means for each individual so that they can actually feel that they have something to contribute to this equity values. And then lastly, we are all government workers, so context and having people feel knowledgeable about how government has been responsible for discriminatory practices and what that means for us now being in the heart of the beast, right? Is now we are government. So what is our responsibility to right those wrongs, even at a step by step? So for me, that has been helpful. And most definitely not everybody in my team started in the same place. And lastly, I mentioned in my comments that some of my team immediately felt as if it was a reflection of their work. Am I doing something wrong? And I think it's important to just model the behavior yourself and know that we can all do better. So.
Something I'd like to add to that too is, kind of thinking about creating relationships with colleagues, because of course, I suspect at many of our institutions, we're all kind of siloed off program by program. I know that's to a degree how it works at the Maryland State Arts Council. And one thing that I found particularly useful, especially kind of to help relationship building both within, with my colleagues, and also to help my colleagues develop relationships with the tribal consultants that we were working with, was to bring my colleagues into those consultations. we specifically did not want to kind of overwhelm the folks who we were consulting with, the tribal consultants during the Land Acknowledgement Project. So it was a relatively small number of MSAC folks represented, but always me, always one of our leadership, either executive director, deputy director, grants director, whoever was not in grants panels at the moment. But then there was always someone else, 1 to 2 other people there taking notes, tracking things, making sure there were no loose ends. And I was pleasantly surprised afterwards how many of my colleagues said, well, that was really meaningful. I'm excited to continue the conversation with this consultant, this tribe, that tribe. It's, you know, it's that education component, it's that relationship building, but it's also kind of building a coalition within the staff, reaching across programs, something that can be, I think, widely applied across the different types of organizations that we all represent.
Thank you. And are there any other questions? Any other hands up? Okay, I actually wanted to ask you a question, Ryan. I think we're all so very impressed with how deep you went into your process. And I wonder if you could reflect for a moment on the sort of variance between the scope you were handed and the scope you developed, because what you developed is so deep and so profound and so oriented around listening. And that's so seldom the scopes folks get handed. Can you talk about that at all?
I can try. That's a fantastic question, Eddie. Well, I suppose I should start with a caveat that I don't think there's a project on this earth that ever ends up where it started. And the process of going through whatever project always results in change. And ours was certainly no exception to that. The idea that, you know, again, our goal was to create resources, but how do you create resources that are meaningful without actually going to the sources? And something else that we found, and I don't think I spoke to this particularly during my part of this afternoon's presentation, is that the scholarship, you know, peer-reviewed scholarship on tribal peoples in Maryland, there's less of it than there is for other geographic regions, for other tribal communities. And that, again, is also part of that broader indigenous erasure that I spoke to. So listening was the only route forward. Tribal peoples in many instances were literally the only authorities on most of the topics that we wanted. We might be able to look into the work by this particular archaeologist, that particular historian, this particular professor, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, tribal folks themselves do have some resources. I'm thinking specifically on tribal websites, but in-depth information of the sort that we have been requested to make available to the public when appropriate, of course, it's certainly not thick on the ground, and in some instances did not exist. So, you know, that listening component was really the only route forward. And again, makes me grateful that the materials that we produce, kind of the byproducts, the recordings of those consultations, will be making their way into a public repository archive, the Maryland Traditions Archive, housed at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, so, you know, that we can actually help develop yet more resources for the public, because that indigenous erasure is, it's endemic. It's difficult to work against sometimes, and listening was really the only route forward.
That's fantastic. And Tariana, I wanted to ask you, I mean, as you've been going through this process over time, can you talk at all about what has happened during the pandemic through this process?
So I remember in March of 2020, right at the beginning, that I was fearful that the focus on the pandemic would for many mean that we don't have the time to talk about equity, which of course, in the midst of the pandemic, equity was so critical, right? And the inequities surfaced. But in terms of the conversations within government, the conversations with partners, I saw a shift, and I was fearful that all of a sudden it would not be a priority anymore. And I started thinking about how do I bring equity very much into the conversation about health, right? So that people could actually live it. And I was part of the emergency response team at the city, so I had an opportunity to actually live that with regards to vaccination and all that. So it became definitely very much focused on health for obvious reasons, but I saw the loss of people feeling like, as if rather than being integrated into everything we do, it was something that we didn't have time to talk about. And then, of course, June happened, George Floyd, and then it was a completely a flip, right? So then it became central to all conversations beyond health, and it became central. And actually, I was able to leverage that momentum into many conversations. So, but I think initially it certainly I felt some distancing with regards to the conversations.
But it's great that you had so much momentum behind you already, and that you were able to bring the depth of work that you'd already sort of achieved in your practice to that moment and to all of these moments over the past couple of years. I realize we're coming up on the half hour beyond what we'd actually scheduled. Let me go ahead and hand it off to you, Randy, in terms of any final questions you have. And I guess you're gonna have to take us home.
Happy to drive everyone home, get everyone home safely. I think I'm so glad that we're recording and archiving this, because I think that people are going to be able to come back and rewatch and really, really wrestle with the depth and complexity of all the work that you guys have delivered today. It was such a rich presentation. Each presenter brought so much content and so much brilliance. So I'm just grateful for that. Eddie and Tatiana were both also co-designers along with Nadia of the overall Cultural Policy Action Lab. So maybe we'll see them again. I think you'll see them again. And, I appreciate that both Ryan and Tatiana put their email in the chat. I do think this is a relationship. I do think this is interactive. We don't want this to feel transactional, like one and done. So both for today, for last week, for all of these sessions that we have together, we hope that it is a dialogue and a relationship that we can build on over time. I hope folks can join us next week with David and Cezanne to talk about placemaking and infrastructure, and how to bring equity as a focus to that area of work. I want to just offer one more thank you to Tatiana and Ryan and Eddie for both spending several hours producing this and then several more hours coming through it with us today. And as you saw from the chat, I think people are very inspired. So please stay engaged. Thanks again to GIA for your support and your partnership. Estrella, Jen, I'm privileged to work with all of you, and I'm just so grateful for this. So we will see you in a couple of weeks. The link is in the chat, giarts.org/Cultural Policy Action Lab /Learning Series. So come find us and let's keep building this community and let's keep operationalizing relationships. Thanks for your time today.